guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Welcome to Conduct Detrimental, the sports law podcast. I'm your co-host, Daniel Wallach. Joining me, as always, is Dan Lust. And if you've been following my sports law career, you've been following me on Twitter over the last couple of years, so much of my trajectory within the world of sports law ties back to Deflategate and the Tom Brady deflated football controversy of 2015 and 2016. And our guest today also has a tie-in to Deflategate. And we're going to switch things up a little bit today and not just do a purely legal podcast, but we're going to talk about a lot of issues and history surrounding the National Football League. So, Dan, how are you doing this week?
Well, Dan, I fought the NCAA, but the NCAA didn't win. I won because I dunked on them.
Is that like I fought the law and the law won?
Well, the law didn't win in this scenario, but I feel like you got that. For those that didn't see, I spoke over Zoom to Florida State. Shout out to Hayes Rule over at the SSLN for setting that up.
Hayes Rule? That's a great name. Right?
Great name.
That would be a great wrestling name.
Yes, great. No, but I was speaking to Florida State, and I had a throwaway line to promote it. And I said something along the lines of, back in March, Trevor Lawrence had a GoFundMe that was taken down because of NCAA's archaic rules. We're going to talk about this and everything else on my NCAA legal panel, whatever I said. So I didn't think anything of it. It wasn't just kind of a throwaway story that I wanted to talk about how the NCAA was, Dan, changing their rules to allow players to have fundraisers because that was something that wasn't allowed. It's like, it wasn't even that controversial. So while I'm in this Florida State Zoom, I get a notification. Essentially, someone from the NCAA's PR team dropped in my replies to tell me that story was not accurate, that the NCAA did not force Trevor Lawrence to take down his podcast. And I didn't say the NCAA forced him. I said the NCAA rules did. I waited to be respectful, but Dan, if you mess with me, if you come at me, you're going to get the horns. You're going to get the smackdown laid on you because I know my wrestling puns too. But
look at the bright side. I mean, your commentary and your insights get on the radar of the NCAA.
The watch list. I think I was civil about it. And our friend of the podcast, Gabe Feldman, sports lawyer extraordinaire over at Tulane, the president of their sports law program, I think he weighed in as the mediator and I think fairly said that the NCAA rules played a role. The NCAA played a role, but it was truthfully Clemson that made the phone call. So we'll say that the NCAA was kind of right on a technicality. Yeah, they didn't tell Trevor Lawrence to take it down, but that's only, Dan, because they didn't see it first. So that being said, that's my fun story of the weekend, that the NCAA is coming after me, which I'll take.
Yeah, we're not going to finish our conversation with Trevor Lawrence. It's not going to stop here. Our guest today is, not only a friend of both of ours, a friend of the show, a friend of football fans everywhere. Is one of the most respected and acclaimed writers covering the National Football League, probably over the last half century. His resume is just, Dallas Morning News covering the Cowboys, New York Daily News for 29 years. He's a Hall of Fame voter, 12 years inside the NFL. I mean, Gary Myers has seen it all and done it all in the National Football League, at least from the journalism side. His Sunday Notes column has been, for the Daily News over all those years, I think the best that there ever was in the business. And now today, he's now joined the podcasting world. But for any fan of New York football, whether you're a Jets fan or Giants fan, or you follow the league as a business, Gary Myers is really one of the most insightful people covering not just the teams that we follow, but just the NFL as a business. And his institutional knowledge is something that I'm looking forward to really getting into and tapping into during this episode. We're going to cover Trevor Lawrence, the Giants, the Jets, the Malays.
No Archman.
Nick Saban, but Bill Belichick, Bill Parcells. Gary Myers' storied career has traversed so many important, generations or at least eras of New York professional football. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation with Gary and kind of taking our podcast into a somewhat different direction in terms of legal versus non-legal. And believe me, you can't have a conversation with Gary Myers and Tom Brady without talking about Deflategate. So hopefully we'll be able to get some of the inside story and some of the background on Deflategate from somebody who spent a lot of time talking to Tom Brady in recent years, and that's Gary Myers.
One little quick note, then we'll drop into Gary. I mean, as listeners of the podcast know, I worked for the New York Giants PR during college and law school. Gary and I crossed paths there. And Dan, I didn't tell you this story beforehand. I was basically, me and a number of different interns or coordinators, whatever we were we would be the liaison to the players and the media. And let's just say there were members of the media that certain players didn't want to talk to if they didn't think they thought highly of them or they said something bad about them. Gary Myers was universally accepted by all players. There was never any issue that I ever had to deal with to screen somebody. Gary is very, by all, every stretch of the word, a legend in the football world. Dan, you've painted it nicely. He's we'll say a friend of the show at this point. Yeah. I think it's a great conversation, and I'm ready to jump right into it, Dan. Unless you have anything else to add.
Sure. No, I'm just saying he has as much gravitas as any journalist who's covered the NFL over the last 40 years. It's earned. The players respect his insights, his views, and he also writes about a lot of legal issues surrounding the NFL. I mean, he was a must-read during Deflategate. He did a lot of coverage surrounding Ezekiel Elliott's legal battle with the National Football League. So he's a really interesting person to talk to, not just about the league as a business and on the field, but also a lot of the off the field stuff. So let's just start our conversation with Gary, and we hope our audience enjoys it. This is one of the best people covering the league.
Okay, with that being said, let us turn to Gary Myers.
Our guest today is a longtime NFL columnist and writer who got his start at the Dallas Morning News in 1981, and he moved over to the Daily News in New York in 1989. He was the NFL insider for Inside the NFL for 12 years. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Brady versus Manning, and we'll ask him today if he's gotten started on the Darnold versus Jones sequel. And more recently, he's the host of a new podcast called The GOAT, Tom Brady, which is the only podcast out there that's dedicated to the career, the life, and the times of NFL greatest of all time, Tom Brady. So welcome to Conduct Detrimental, Gary Myers. How are you?
I'm doing great, guys. Thank you so much for having me on.
Let's go right into it. Let's work backwards. Tom Brady is sort of the connector between you and me, Gary. I've been reading you going back to 1989. I was a second-year law school student when you moved over to the Daily News for Bill Parcells' last couple of years. But we only met for the first time in 2016 during the U.S. Court of Appeals Second Circuit oral argument in Deflategate. And that's the topic that kind of launched my sports law career. And now it has, led to a podcast series for you. So can you tell us what you have found so compelling about Tom Brady? I mean, you've written a book about him and now a podcast. What led you to this decision? And can you tell us a little bit about the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I was approached by Diversion Podcasts, which works with iHeartRadio, and they did a podcast about the Dream Team that was written by Jack McCallum with Sports Illustrated. And they had written the book and they turned that into a podcast, and it got tremendous reaction. So they decided they wanted to pick another book and base a podcast on that. So they approached me about my Brady versus Manning book and asked me if I could just really center it and focus it on Brady, because they wanted to call it the GOAT, Tom Brady. And fortunately, I saved all my interviews from the book. So it really is 12 episodes. I narrate basically his football career and use these interviews that I got while researching my book and some of the interviews that I've done since that time, and pop them in there during the course of each episode. And I think 3 or 4 episodes have been posted already, and it's one every Monday. They put a new one up, and the reaction so far has been very favorable, and I'm having a lot of fun doing it. The reason they're starting a whole GOAT series is because there's not a lot of players that you can say are definitively the greatest of all time in their sports. So I don't think we can really argue at this point that Tom Brady is, if he's not the greatest football player of all time, because how do you compare him with Jim Brown and Jerry Rice and things like that? But I don't think there's any question he's the greatest quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, you can't talk about Tom Brady without also bringing up the subject of Deflategate. That's where our relationship traces back to and where we met. Can you tell me, or I guess in your view, how impactful the Deflategate controversy was, and what does that mean for his legacy, if anything?
That's a great question. And I think I have what I can now consider to be an answer that'll stand the test of time. Dan, if we were talking about this prior to the 2016 season, in which, he'd thrown up the white flag after the Second Circuit Court of Appeals had overturned his victory in Judge Berman's courtroom. So if we're going into the 2016 season and he's sitting out the first 4 games, and you say, how is this going to impact his legacy? I probably would have said, I think it's going to go in the second paragraph when Tom Brady retires. First paragraph, he wins X number of Super Bowls, has been to the Super Bowl X number of times, has set this record and that record. And the second paragraph is, however, he was found to be caught cheating by the NFL, whether you agree with it or not. And he had to sit out the first 4 games in 2016. But now we're 4 years removed from that. And he's won 2 more Super Bowls since then. And he's moved on to Tampa, which has created a whole new chapter in his career. Deflategate now moves to the 6th or 7th paragraph. Most people have come to realize since then there was a bunch of nonsense. I think at the time I was one of the few media people, maybe outside of Boston, who was saying the NFL, it was just a witch hunt as a make-up call to the owners who were upset that Goodell didn't punish Belichick enough in Spygate. I just thought it was a connected dots investigation without any really definitive proof that he cheated. And, it's taken a couple of years after that. And I think most media people have come around to how I was thinking at the time. And I think this impacts his legacy whatsoever. I mean, that's a long way of saying I think as time has gone on, it becomes less and less important.
I think the helpful detail about Deflategate was that it finally lifted the veil off of the NFL's secret arbitration proceedings. And even though the result ultimately went the NFL's way, at the trial court, the trial judge, Judge Richard Berman, found in favor of Tom Brady. And that was one of the few labor arbitrations. One of the 1 or 2% of labor arbitrations that get vacated based upon, a fundamental fairness issue or some kind of significant procedural error. So when the light was shined or the spotlight was shined on the kind of process or due process that Tom Brady didn't necessarily receive, I think any fair-minded, fan or lawyer, somebody with an understanding of the proceeding and how he was deprived of a level playing field, I think, for me at least, that changed at least my attitude and my perspective on thinking that Brady was probably guilty to it doesn't matter if he was probably guilty. The NFL never afforded him the same kind of process that any litigant should get going into a civil lawsuit. He was denied the opportunity to take the deposition of a key witness. He was deprived relevant and material interview notes from Ted Wells' law firm. So from my vantage point, the NFL committed a grievous fundamental procedural and process error in depriving Tom Brady of what I would consider to be his day in court. And he never got a sufficient one. And by the time it gets to district court, it's already a significantly uphill battle because these awards or these arbitration proceedings rarely get vacated by a federal court. So he went up against that. But I think at least in the minds of a lot of us, he at least rehabilitated his reputation in terms of, the perception of the facts. And also really showed the NFL to be, basically going on a witch hunt here. And I'm not sure that prior to the federal court lawsuit, that perception had sufficiently been out there.
I agree with what you said, but Berman's overturning of the suspension, the way I understood it, and I know you understand this stuff better than me, was just based, like you said, was on the process. And did he get due process? Mm-hmm. It wasn't based on the facts of the case. So although he got the suspension overturned, I think in the minds of a lot of football fans, okay, he won, somewhat on a technicality. To the average football fan would consider a technicality. You consider it a grievous error because you're an attorney. What fans really wanted to know, and what the public really wanted to know was, did he indeed tell those 2 locker room attendants to deflate the footballs before the game against the Colts because it was cold out and it was raining out? And it is easier. Most quarterbacks say it is easier to grip a football in that kind of weather when it's a little underinflated, that it's easier to grip. I don't think the NFL and Ted Wells with that whole, what was that expression that he used, Dan?
More probably than not that there was so many attenuated components of that conclusion.
It was a lower standard of proof, right?
That's right. It wasn't a preponderance of the evidence.
Right.
The NFL's justice system isn't the equivalent of a criminal trial or even a civil trial where a preponderance of the evidence is enough. But now that you've devoted a podcast series and a book to Tom Brady and his rivalry with Peyton Manning, Brady has never really been recently outspoken or has discussed the circumstances surrounding Deflategate in recent years. Will your podcast kind of get more into the background and how he perceived, the proceedings against him and whether he thought he was treated fairly, because it's really been a footnote to his career over the last couple of years. But as he'd been a little bit more forthcoming in talking about this controversy that for obvious reasons he'd like to put behind him.
Yeah, I mean, I tried in the first, I'd say, 12 months after all the court hearings and, going from one courtroom to the other. And finally over, I did try to get him to express how he really felt about how he was treated by the commissioner and all that. And the closest I came was they beat Pittsburgh in the 2016 AFC Championship game in Foxborough. Again, that was the season where we sat out the first 4 games. Thomas by his locker after the game. And so they were going to play the Falcons in Houston. And that's the game they had that wild comeback and won the game. But I said to him, would it be sort of justice on your part, justice served, if after all this, Goodell's got to hand you the MVP, the Super Bowl MVP trophy? You feel that, it's kind of like, in your face kind of thing. And he said that it was a typical Brady answer. I only have love in my heart. I don't think that way. That's not the way I'm wired. I was trying so hard to get him to say he wanted revenge on Goodell, and he couldn't wait to grab that Super Bowl MVP trophy from him. He is such a focused guy, and he tries to eliminate all the negatives in his life. Once he served that suspension, I think he enjoyed his 4 weeks off at a time of the year that he never had it before. I think he went, I don't know if he went to Italy or France or something with his wife during that period of time. But once he came back and started practicing again, he wasn't looking back. And he has never really discussed Deflategate once it was over. During that, a couple of days after they were accused in that Colts championship game, he held that press conference that I thought he was just really nervous. That's before they left for the Super Bowl that year. Until everybody was able to make their own judgments, I thought in that press conference, he didn't handle himself as coolly as he used to, which I think created a lot of doubt in people's mind whether he was guilty or not. But I know he doesn't think about it anymore. I know it was very, very upsetting to his family, especially his parents. But he has completely moved on from that. And maybe when he writes his own book, when he retires in 10 years, that was a joke, Dan, 10 years.
I saw it. I caught it.
You got it.
Who knows, though? I mean, honestly.
It's funny, Dan. 5 or 6 years ago, he said he wanted to play until he was 45, and everybody laughed at him. Well, he's 43. The Bucs are playing well. He's playing well. Maybe Tampa becomes the first team to play the Super Bowl on its home field after the season.
I think you said Tampa, Gary. I think you meant Tampa.
Tampa Bay, right.
Yeah. I'm only laughing. Dan and we've spoke about this. The same can be said for LeBron James with modern medicine. You can extend careers to a certain point that we never could before. So I think it's a good segue. I mean, your book, Peyton versus Tom, Manning versus Brady, there was a debate when I was growing up. It was probably Peyton was the guy, but longevity has since maybe shifted that towards Brady's equation. But, speaking about Peyton, Dan and I were talking before we spoke with you. So, I know you followed the Jets closely, the Giants closely. 1997 was almost the year where Peyton Manning became a member of the New York Jets. Obviously, It was, as you will recall, there was instead of, I don't think they were calling it tanking back then, but the version of tanking for Trevor was tanking for Peyton. And the Jets ended up with the first overall pick in the 97 draft, which was subsequently traded to the Rams, who took Orlando Pace, and they traded down further and further. That was an example, right, of a top player who didn't want to play for, we're speculating, but there was at least some reports out there that Peyton didn't want to play for the Jets. Fast forward 7 years to 2004, there was another Manning brother who wanted to play in New York, the first overall pick that year, Eli Manning, and he basically said he didn't want to play for the Chargers, who had the number 1 pick at the time. He was very coy about what he wanted to do. Ended up working a trade. The Giants picked Rivers at 4, and they had a little swap. So I remember as a Giants fan back then, as a fun fact, there were some reports, and Gary, maybe you can confirm this before I ask you my real question. J.P. Lozman was well-liked in Giants camp, right? I'm not crazy.
You might be crazy on this one, because if they weren't able to make that trade, they were going to take Ben Roethlisberger.
But very much we're in a world today that's tank for Trevor. So we have the Giants, they got their win today. And we have the Jets at 0-5. I want to get your thoughts on this, being a historian of New York football. Do you think there is any world where Trevor Lawrence tries to play his way and maybe some kind of move to not be drafted by a New York football team first overall?
Well, just to set the record straight, the Jets are now 0-6. And also, I just want to tell you the version that I know from 1997. Parcells had just been hired by the Jets, and they were coming off a 1-15 season. Obviously, they had a lot of holes to fill, although they had more talent than the Jets team does this year. And what happened in 96 was much more about coaching than it was about talent, because they had some decent players in that team. It's just Rich Kotite was the coach. Anyhow, so Peyton has a year to go at Tennessee, and the Jets have the first pick. Parcells to this day says, I couldn't tell Peyton we were definitely going to take him because the NFL was very stringent in those days, and they were looking at me, and if I told, they didn't want us to encourage any underclassmen to come into the draft. They wanted us to let them make their decision, and then we start the process. So according to Parcells and according to Archie, Peyton's dad, Parcells never committed that he would take Peyton, although everybody believes he would have, and that Peyton had to make his decision by the end of January whether he was going to go back for senior year at Tennessee, and Parcells was not ready to commit at that point. Now, I think that in hindsight, certainly that was foolish. If Peyton was just waiting to hear from Parcells, yes, I'm going to take you, and then he says, okay, then I'm coming out.
Okay.
Yeah. So Gary, I think it's interesting, Gary, and the reason I ask it, I mean, Bill Parcells is no slouch, right? He's one of the best coaches of our generation. I don't know that the Giants and Jets' current situation is so stable where it would be a decision, right? Like we can kind of say with tongue in cheek, if Bill Parcells would have said, we're taking you, Peyton, he would have gone to, he would have been a New York Jet. As much as I like Coach Judge, I'm not sure I love the Jet situation that much, but right. I don't think either situation is something that a top player like Trevor Lawrence wants to walk into. So I don't know. I can see something like that happening. I mean, it's not unprecedented, of course. I mean,
no. I listen. Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely agree with you on that. Although I don't think it's going to happen, only because he'd be leaving too much money on the table. And what happens if he gets hurt next year?
Oh, I'm talking about more maybe of an Eli Manning situation where he just says, I'm not going to play for X team.
I see what you're saying.
Eli said he's not going to play for the Chargers, and he got his wish, right? And he never played for the Chargers.
Yeah, Eli said he was going to go back to school for a year and then go back in the draft, which you all knew wasn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. But, maybe Trevor Lawrence doesn't even declare for the draft if the Jets have the first pick and he doesn't want to go there. Or maybe he says, I'm coming out, but Jets don't take me. Or maybe the Jets hire a really good coach and they get to make Trevor the cornerstone of the rebuild. And he wants to play in New York because of the marketing opportunities, although it really doesn't matter where you play anymore. You could still make a lot of money off the field. But maybe it becomes a more attractive situation 3 months from now than it is at the present time with an 0-6 team and Adam Gase is the coach. The Giants won a game today, so I almost think they're out of the Trevor Lawrence derby. I don't see the Jets winning a game this year. I mean, I really don't.
The Jets find a way to mess it up. I'm pretty confident.
Well, let's talk, Gary. Let's talk about tanking, because last year during the 2019 season, you were very vocal about the Giants looking at the long term and basically putting themselves in a position to draft Chase Young, and you thought it would have been just completely reckless for the Giants to beat the Redskins in the second to last game of the regular season, because look at what's happened now. The Washington football team now has a generational defensive end or an impactful pass rusher, and the Giants ended up with Andrew Thomas, who is, to be charitable about it, has been struggling during his first 4 games. But with the Jets, you're talking about possibly reviving or return to glory and basically saving face and who they should possibly hire to kind of right the ship. And I'm wondering, is it the best thing in the long run to move on for Adam Gase before he can run the table and go 0 for 16? Might 0 for 16 be the best course for that organization, because the Giants have shown that they've elevated winning now or winning that game to set the tone for 2019, missing out on potentially the next coming of Lawrence Taylor. Not that there'll ever be another Lawrence Taylor, but right. I think you get the point.
Yeah, I mean, what I was saying about the Giants last year, the players will not tank. Players play hard because whatever they do is going to be on tape. And whether it's to keep their job the following season or to impress another team, they don't want to be seen playing half speed or quitting. It's how you manipulate the personnel that management and the coaches could kind of guide it that you don't win the game. And I thought that the game that they beat Washington, second last game of the season, it was Daniel Jones's first game back after being out for a period about a month or whatever, or 3 weeks. And he threw 5 touchdown passes and they won in overtime. And Saquon had a great game and it broke a long losing streak for Jones. And everybody's saying, and I'm saying, I think in the long run, that victory really hurts them because they just lost out on Chase Young. And let's see next year if we think the victory over Washington in week 16 was worth more than Chase Young. And I think we can sit here and say, okay, there was no carryover victory into 2020 because the Giants lost their first 5 games and they still don't have a pass rusher. And the tackle they took is just okay. As far as the Jets, I'm telling you, Dan, I have some real good friends who are just nutty Jets fans that want Adam Gase to stay.
They're that nutty that they actually wanted to. I thought we were going to say that all Jets fans were nutty, but this is
no. I mean, if I'm a Jets fan, I want Adam Gase to stay. I mean, who wants to win 4 or 5 games?
You're very
who wants to win 4 or 5 games and jeopardize the Trevor Lawrence lottery?
If you listen, the Jets are 0-6. Obviously, I'm not even going to say they're not going to make the playoffs. They're not going to win 3 games. And if you get a stink, this is a great season to stink, right? There's no fans in the stands. You don't have to worry about fire Gase chants starting up. You don't have to worry about protests in the parking lot. They're really doing this in anonymity in terms of any face-to-face contact with the people who would be really upset to the season ticket holders. Obviously, fans are upset when you listen to the talk shows, but you don't have to listen to the radio. You don't have to read the newspapers. But if there were fans in the stands, it's very hard to ignore that, especially come November, there would have been 50,000 no-shows. But now they can do it in relative anonymity. So if you get a stink, this is a great year to stink. And in the long run, you're making an investment in the future if you wind up with Trevor Lawrence. And this is a big if if indeed is a generational talent, like everybody says. I need to see a little bit more of him, but obviously he looks like he's going to be a great NFL player.
So, Gary, I might have an equally big if question. Now, let's say that 1-1 pick does fall in the Giants and Jets hands. Do you see both teams jettisoning, Darnold or Jones? Do you see them just being taken out of town? I don't know what truly happens. The only thing, maybe the closest equivalent in recent memory is the Arizona Cardinals, who just sent Josh Rosen packing, and then the show was Kyler's. I mean, I imagine that that's in the cards, but I think, Darnold and Jones were thought of more highly than Rosen was at the time. So what do you see in that world? Do you think both the Jets and the Giants would pull the trigger if they got Lawrence?
Well, here's the thing. If either of them wind up with the first pick, that means they had a pretty crappy season, right? Mm-hmm. And if they have a crappy season, that means the quarterback had a really bad season. So you're looking at them a little bit differently. And this is assuming Darnold gets back on the field relatively soon. But so it's 10 games to go. I'm not sure what his status is for the Jets' next game. But let's at least say that he plays the last 8 games of the year and the Jets still get the first pick in the draft. That means he didn't play well the first 4 games and he didn't play well the last 8 games because they got the first pick in the draft. That means that to that point, he's terribly underachieved. And there's got to be tremendous doubt whether he'll ever be an elite quarterback. You look at the Daniel Jones situation and you say the same thing. If the Giants finish 1-15 or 2-14 and get the first pick in the draft, that means Daniel Jones has had a really bad season. And you can't be convinced that he's going to be your quarterback for the long term. So now you're faced with a situation. Do you cut your losses, try to get back a 2nd-round pick, a 3rd-round pick maybe, or a 4th round? I don't know. Arizona got a 2 and a 5 for Josh Rosen, and he was terrible as a rookie. If you can take Trevor Lawrence and get a 2 and a 5 for either Darnold or Jones, then I say you have to do it because it just means if you've got that pick, that neither one of those guys has proven to you that he can win in the NFL.
Gary, this causes me to play the ultimate what-if game. I mean, if you pick the wrong quarterback in the NFL at that high, it could set your franchise back 5 years. Not every organization gets a do-over with Trevor Lawrence. But let's look at, Dave Gettleman's drafting record and his failure to prioritize premium draft positions. He went for a running back in year 1 instead of the Darnold or Josh Allen, or maybe even look back for Lamar Jackson later. Let's really take somewhat of a deeper look at the organizational malaise surrounding the Giants and the New York Jets. It just seems like these conversations are happening year after year after year. And, one fired coach begets another fired coach. And the more things change, the more things stay the same. Over the last 30 years, the Giants have only had a winning record in 12 of those years. You've been following this franchise more closely than anybody over that time horizon. What are they doing wrong as a franchise?
I mean, one point, I guess, if I can just go back for 1 second, one point I want to make is it's really important to remember that Joe Douglas did not draft Sam Darnold. Dave Gettleman drafted Daniel Jones. It's going to be a lot easier for Joe Douglas to give up on Darnold because it's not high than it will be for Gettleman with Jones, assuming Gettleman still has the job. Now, to this question about what the Giants have done wrong, if you think about it, the two Super Bowl years obviously stand out during the Coughlin years, 07 and 11. Mm-hmm. In 07, the Giants were 10-6. And when they won the Super Bowl, it tied for the worst record ever, single season record for a Super Bowl champion. And 4 years later, they broke that record because they were 9-7, the worst record ever for a Super Bowl champion. They did not have great regular seasons in those 2 years. The best Giants team of the last 20 years was in 2008 when they were rolling along until Thanksgiving, clearly the best team in the league. At that point, the favorite to repeat. And then Plexico Burress accidentally shot himself in the leg in the nightclub, and the Giants can no longer throw the ball. I thought they held on to Jerry Reese too long. I thought they held on to Coughlin too long. Then when they got rid of Coughlin, they kept Reese and they promoted Ben McAdoo. It just became the key to NFL teams is the ownership. And the owners have to be well enough connected that when it's time to make crucial hires, that you don't have to go out and get a search firm, that you have enough connections on your own in the league to go out and hire the right people. And I'm not sure when they fired Jerry Reese that, John Mara was comfortable with Gettleman because he had worked for the Giants before, and he had Ernie Accorsi, who I respect very much, run the search for him. And one of Ernie's best friends was Gettleman, and he had just gotten fired by the Panthers. I just don't think that was a very creative hire. It was an old school hire. And to me, it indicated that the Giants weren't really ready to make that next step in and I'm not big on analytics, but just somebody, Gettleman was more of a throwback. Pat Shermer was a terrible hire, and I thought so at the time. So it really just comes down to ownership has got to hire the right people and then let them do their job. I think Joe Judge is the right guy now. But the problem is going to be if Gettleman retires or gets fired at the end of the season, they got to bring a general manager in who didn't hire Joe Judge unless you promote from within and it's somebody that the Judge already has a relationship with. They got to get the general manager and the coach on the same timeline. And I don't think either of the New York teams have done that.
Let's talk about a couple of names that might have been available for the New York Giants. If you go back to some of the last five hires, Gettleman, Reese, Judge, Shermer, McAdoo, they basically it's an inside connection, a past or current relationship to the team, promoting from within. The Giants had several opportunities to touch back with Bill Parcells over the years. They passed up Bill Belichick for Ray Handley, even though Belichick had already taken the Cleveland job. But I think the writing was on the wall that George Young had preferred Handley over Belichick as Parcells' eventual successor. They didn't consider Belichick in 97. In all these years, Nick Saban's name has been tossed around as a potential Giant hire. They were negotiating a contract with him in 1997. And I've been basically praying and hoping that Saban would find his way back to the Giants over the years, and in particular during the recent hiring spree in 2016, 2018. Why has that never happened? And what's the backstory behind Nick Saban not getting the Giants job when it was all but assured to him back in 97?
Yeah, they wanted to hire him. George Young wanted to hire him before Jim Fossil was hired. And they thought they had a deal done, that they got on pretty far down the road with him, and Saban didn't want to do it. Listen, it's easy to say, why not Nick Saban, right? I mean, look, tremendously successful, the best college coach of all time. But he did coach in the NFL as a head coach with the Miami Dolphins, and he was 14 and 18 in a 2-year period. And some coaches are just cut out to be college coaches. And Nick Saban might be one of them. He might be, like I said, the greatest college coach of all time. But if he was an NFL coach, he might have been one of these guys that bounced from job to job. Because the Giants did have dance with him a couple of times after that. And I think he's one of those guys that likes to be romanced and never had any intention of going back into the NFL.
Yeah, well, I'll say in Coach Saban's defense, I was down here in Miami in 2005, 2006. He actually had a pretty good first year, and I think he bet on the wrong quarterback. He traded a number 2 pick for Dante Culpepper instead of signing Drew Brees as an unrestricted free agent. I'm not suggesting that Saban would have remained in Miami all those years, but I think his legacy was sealed basically with that one bad personnel decision where he
wait,
was
hold
a
on.
lot.
Dan, that was not him. That was the doctors.
Right? Like Brees didn't clear the physical?
Yeah, I mean, Culpepper was coming off a major knee injury. I think he definitely tore his ACL and maybe 2 other ligaments. And Brees was coming off in the final game of the previous season with the Chargers. He suffered a really serious shoulder injury. And the Dolphins doctors decided that Culpepper was less of a physical risk. And they had to give up a 2nd-round pick to get Dante Culpepper. And like you guys say, Brees was an unrestricted free agent. So not only did they pick the wrong quarterback and the doctors make a mistake, but just in the compensation end of it, they had to give up a 2nd-round pick, which is pretty valuable. I know Nick Saban wanted Drew Brees and not Dante Culpepper. I know that. But when the doctors told him that, no, you can't do that because we don't know if Brees is ever going to play again, or if he plays again, we don't know what shape his shoulder is going to be in. Mm-hmm. Saban's hands were tied. What would have happened if the Dolphins doctors saw him the same way that the Saints doctors saw him? And he went, I know that Brees wanted to sign with the Dolphins over the Saints. That's a fact. But the Dolphins never offered him a contract. There's a lot of things in history. If Tom Brady passed over 198 times in the draft, what would have happened to him if he wound up with a different team? Could he have been as successful? And if he was, what would that team have been like? Instead of the Patriots, maybe the Cleveland Browns. Instead, they didn't take Spurgeon Wynn and they took Tom Brady and they got a good coach in there. Maybe the Browns would be considered the model franchise. So there's a lot of...
So timing is everything. I mean, I guess on that too, right? I don't even know if Brady ever gets a chance to start if Bledsoe doesn't go down. So everything happens for a reason. So I think, and you had me thinking about it with, this Culpepper Brees medical decision, right? There was, and it's not real malpractice, but in a, this is a legal podcast, so we got to find the legal tie-ins. I mean, like, there was some level of mismanagement on that part, and maybe a decent segue to the Le'Veon Bell handling. We'll stay within the AFC East. Dan and I had some fun with it on Twitter. Le'Veon, obviously, timing is everything. Dan and I are struggling New York Knicks fans. I remember I was at the draft a couple years ago. Phil Jackson was on his way out. They let him pick Frank Ntilikina, and then they got rid of then they got rid of Phil Jackson, and then Frank Ntilikina made no sense within the triangle offense. So I bring that up within the Le'Veon Bell situation. It's not so often that you have a disagreement about whether to sign a given player, but my understanding, and I think it was your reporting that it's highlighted in this as well, but there was a disagreement about whether or not to bring Le'Veon Bell in, and a disagreement between the GM and the coach. And now, 19 months later, Le'Veon Bell is out of town, but $27 million richer. So I didn't say the word malpractice by mistake. I think this might be potentially, Dan, maybe the beginnings of a lawsuit against the Jets for intentional infliction of emotional distress, mismanagement, or D, all of the above.
Emotional distress to who? The Jets fans?
To Jets fans, I think so.
Well, it wasn't my reporting, but I do have heard since, and I know people that have reported this out, that McCagnon wanted Bell and Gase didn't. Gase didn't want to spend that much money on a running back because he believed in running back by committee. So it's a horrible situation when a player comes in and the coach is the one who doesn't want him. One thing if the coaches talk the general manager into it, the players don't have to deal with the general manager on a day-to-day basis. But if the coach is the one who doesn't want you, then it's a problem. And clearly, by the way that Gase used Le'Veon Bell over the games or whatever that he was with the Jets was a pretty clear indication that he didn't want him on the team. And I'm really interested to see how Bell does in Kansas City, how Andy Reid incorporates him into the offense, and whether he's still got something left, because I was not impressed with him at all. I know the Jets have a terrible offensive line, but to me, he just had no burst anymore. It'll be fascinating to see whether he gets that hop back in his step playing for a much better team.
I think at least with Bell, and then, I'll turn it over to Dan. I remember watching him in Pittsburgh, and it was really those that he'd kind of sit behind the hole in the line, and then he would burst through it. And then maybe I'm the lead plaintiff in this class action lawsuit because I spent a lot of money on my Le'Veon Bell auction pick. And I'm actually kind of happy he's going to the Chiefs. I could see that working out well, but again, that's a good O-line that's invested in very heavily to protect Patrick Mahomes. So maybe we see a resurgence of Bell, but I think, Gary, you said something really interesting. If that's true, right, and you would know better than we would, if Gase was using Bell in such a way that he didn't want him on the team, that's as much as here's the good, Dan knows I'm very good at these legal tie-ins, maybe grounds for termination for Adam Gase, misusing an asset, maybe the most expensive asset the Jets have had in years. I think if anything is grounds for termination, maybe it's that in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think Gase's defense would probably be that, look how many times we gave him the ball. Last year he averaged 3.2 yards a carry. Why should I give it to him anymore when he's not even getting 4 yards a pop? And the whole situation, to me, was almost doomed from the start. A whole other story, how I think that Le'Veon Bell made a horrific decision sitting out a year in Pittsburgh, losing money that he'll never make back, even though the Steelers would not guarantee a penny past the first year. They weren't going to cut him after 1 year of a new contract. And he downgraded tremendously in the quality of the team that he's playing for. The Steelers always have a good offensive line. And a player like Bell, who, Dan, as you mentioned, he's a patient runner. He sits behind the line and then waits to see his hole and then just scoots right through it. You need a great offensive line to do stuff like that. Otherwise, you're always getting hit behind the line of scrimmage. And that's what was happening with the Jets. There were times, he had no chance to get back to even get back to the line of scrimmage, which is pathetic when you think about it. But that's why I'm just interested to see how he's going to be playing behind a good offensive line. And the Chiefs need somebody with his skill set, especially coming out of the backfield. Did Jets just totally misuse him, or were his numbers indicative of where his skills are right now? I don't know.
Gary, before we let you go, I really want to get into a topic I've been dying to ask you for a while. You're a Hall of Fame inductor for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. First of all, as someone who's covered the New York Giants going back to 1989, how gratifying was it for you to see George Young inducted into the Hall after all these years? And unfortunately, neither he nor his wife were alive to see the day. But can you talk about the impact that George Young had on the game of football?
I was disappointed that George didn't get in a very long time ago when his wife was still alive. George passed away about 20 years ago from a rare illness, and he was a great man. To get into the Hall of Fame, you have to show that not only did you have a big impact on the team that you worked for, but also had an impact on the league. After George left the Giants, he became basically the director of football operations in the league office. He was the right-hand man to Paul Tagliabue for a number of years. What he did for the Giants, starting in 1964, the Giants went until 1981, until they made the playoffs again. And George got there in 79, and he took over a team that had very limited talent. It was way before the free agency days, so he's going to have to build it through the draft. And he working for an ownership in Wellington and Tim Mara. They each owned 50% of the team, and they didn't talk to each other. On Wednesdays, they used to sit in this boardroom or conference room at Giant Stadium, and George would be in the middle, and Tim would talk to Wellington through George, and Wellington would talk to Tim through George, and they wouldn't talk to each other. That's a very difficult road to navigate. And to do it as adeptly as George did, and then build a team that won 2 Super Bowls in his first 12 seasons as the general manager, that's an incredible accomplishment. And then when you put on top, again, what he did for the league and on the competition committee for a number of years, when we formed the contributor committee about 5-6 years ago, I thought he should have been the first one to get in. And it turns out several general managers got in ahead of him. And again, it's too late for, he didn't have any children, a very small family. And like I mentioned, his wife had passed away. And it's just a shame that when they finally do the induction next summer, because it didn't happen this year because of COVID, it's just a shame that there are no real close family members that would take a lot of pride in George finally getting in.
Well, I can tell you that this Giant fan certainly does. And I think I probably speak for tens of thousands that, I can't even place a number on it. But if you followed New York Giants football in the 1970s and experienced those rough patches, at least for me in my lifetime, there'll never be a Giants team that means as much to me as that run from 1981, even with Ray Perkins, all the way through 1990. Bavaro, Banks, Taylor, Sims, Parcells, Belichick, Coughlin towards the tail end. That is the definitive era of New York Giants football in my lifetime. And George Young was the architect of that franchise. So while he may not have a close family or any family members remaining to take pride in that induction. I think every Giants fan owes him a debt of gratitude, which does bring me to a couple of other Giants from that era who aren't in the Hall of Fame that perhaps should be. Can you make a case for Mark Bavaro and or Carl Banks? I mean, for my money, Bavaro was the best tight end or one of the best tight ends of that era, two-time Super Bowl champion. And of course, Carl Banks, the strong side linebacker opposite Lawrence Taylor, and he may have been overshadowed by Taylor, but can you speak to their candidacy as well as that of Phil Simms?
Well, Banks made it to the final 25 this past voting period for the first time. Unfortunately, it was his 20th and final year of eligibility as a modern era candidate. So now he just goes into this huge pool with all the seniors. I wish that Carl, and maybe part of it, I can take responsibility for. I wish that we were able to get Carl that far along 10 years ago. In cases like Banks, who's not, a surefire first ballot guy, sometimes it takes a few years to build up momentum to get them in. And the fact that he didn't make it from the cut from 25 to 15, so only the top 15 get discussed in the meeting room. It's unfortunate. It happened.
Was he a Hall of Fame player? Is he deserving of induction?
Oh, I think standards? So. Yeah, I definitely. I mean, I think Ricky Jackson got in, and I think, Carl was certainly his equal, different kind of player. But, Ricky Jackson, to me, was not as good a player as Carl. Carl's problem was, as you mentioned, overshadowed by LT, and then Harry Carson in the first Super Bowl. So you have two linebackers from that first Super Bowl team who were in the Hall of Fame. It took Harry 13 years. Carl is just one of those guys that slipped through the cracks, unfortunately. Bavaro didn't play long enough. When he was healthy and productive, he was the best tight end in football. It's just his career was just too short. We made an exception, sort of. I mean, we didn't call it an exception, but when Terrell Davis got in a few years ago, the comparison was made to Gale Sayers' career cut short by injury, but when they were healthy, they were unstoppable. Terrell Davis was responsible for getting Elway the 2 Super Bowl rings at the end of his career. For the years at Bavaro, 86 to 90, when he was healthy, I mean, he was an unstoppable tight end. Phil Simms needed that second Super Bowl to get in.
That's kind of an asterisk in a way, because until he got hurt that season, I think it was the 1990 season, right. He was 9-0 or something, and he I guess I forget the nature of the injury, but he got injured in that game against the Buffalo Bills, 2 unbeaten teams, right? Was that the head-to-head matchup? And who's to say that he wouldn't have won that second Super Bowl?
Well, I think the Giants had lost a game or two going to the Buffalo game. Yeah, I think, listen, it's hard to, you asked Phil about that San Francisco championship game where Hostetler won the game with his legs against a great defense. Phil says, I can't say I would have won that game. So he knows if he won the second Super Bowl, he likely would be in the Hall of Fame, but he's not saying if he didn't get hurt that he would have won that game. I mean, it's impossible to project. It's like Drew Bledsoe, if he hadn't gotten hurt, would he have won all those Super Bowls that Brady did? Probably not. Could he have won one? Maybe. So, but I don't. There's no doubt in my mind that if Phil had won that Super Bowl after the 90 season, considering he was 22 out of 25 in the 86 game against Denver, and then if he had another one to go with it, Jim Plunkett's the only quarterback that's won 2 that's not in, and Phil was a far superior player to Jim Plunkett.
Yeah, Gary, I think in some ways Phil was a victim of circumstances. He wins the Super Bowl in 86, and then there's the strike or the lockout from 87, and they come back, replacement players, they never get their bearings back. Then in 88, Lawrence Taylor suspended for 4 games. They missed the playoffs. 89, Flipper Anderson. 90, the injury. And then at the beginning of his career, Bill Parcells inexplicably chose Scott Bruner over him. So in some ways, I mean, Phil Simms lost. And then, of course, George Young cutting bait from him in 1993 and depriving him of perhaps a couple of more years of relatively high level of productivity, giving way to Dave Brown from Duke. So I think in some ways, Simms's career was very star-crossed or very snake-bit. I don't know what the right word is, but I think he was a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. Early in his career, he really had a hard time staying on the field. He had a lot of injuries. And that's the reason when Parcells took over in 83 that he went with Bruner, because Parcells got to the Giants in 81. He had seen Bruner play more time with the Giants than he saw Phil. So he went with the guy that he was more familiar and comfortable with. He realized his mistake early in the season, and put Phil in a game. I think it was against the Jets, and Phil got hurt when he got put into that game. So the 83 season became a disaster for him. And then after the year, Parcells nearly got fired, realized Sims was far superior to Bruner, and went with him. That's when Phil's career took off. I think in 84, he had a 4,000-yard passing. 85, they lost to the Bears. And 86, they won it. And you're right, 87 deprived them of any chance to build on their championship. But I believe they were 0-2 going into the strike. So they didn't get off to a good start that year. But that whole season was an aberration because the players those first two games knowing they were going on strike after the second game and having no idea if they were even coming back. So the motivation in those first couple of games was lacking.
I could talk about these years for the next 4 or 5 hours. I mean, to this day, the most memorable period of New York Giants football for me, and I have a memory like an elephant when it comes to, 81, 82, 83, Flipper Anderson. It's frozen in my mind like it was yesterday. And I'm so glad that I could scratch that itch today in a conversation with you. I've been meaning to ask you these questions all these years.
I've been very excited about this interview.
You've been generous with your time, Gary, for sure. And I didn't even get a Parcells or Belichick story out of you. So we're going to have to bring you back sometime in the future. And could you tell our audience a little bit about where they can find your podcast, The GOAT, Tom Brady, and how frequently you record these, and basically just tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking me that. If you go on Diversion Pods, Diversion pods.com, you can find it there. You can get it on Apple, or as they say, wherever you get your podcasts. You can Google my name and the GOAT Brady, and it'll come up that way. A new one gets posted every Monday, 3 or 4 into it right now. I've taped 8 of them. I have 2 more written, and I'm going to be recording this week. And then episodes 11 and 12 done in a few weeks. And so it'll go for like another 2 months or so, I guess. And I told you earlier that today I finished writing the one about Deflategate, and I went back and read some of my old stories from a few years ago just to reacquaint myself with some of the particulars, and it was a wild period of time. I'll tell you that. It was amazing, but it allowed me to meet you. So I'm not sure that Bruce would say that was worth it, but I think it was.
It was definitely worth it for me, Gary. I cherish the relationship. You've given me some really good advice a couple of times when I was, considering some options in sports law, and I really appreciate that. And I look forward to whatever you're going to be doing, next. I've started listening to the first podcast episode, and I really hope to be able to see your work again somewhere. Whether I used to religiously read your Sunday notes column and your insights on a regular basis outside of Twitter, at least in the newspaper, are deeply missed by me. I thought you had the best Sunday notes column in the country, and I look forward to continuing to follow you. But whatever you do, you can count on me as being a listener and somebody who, follows your career. So good luck. And we hope to have you back on soon for those Parcells and Belichick stories from years past. So thank you for spending an hour of your time on Conduct Detrimental. It was great to get into all these different subjects and topics that we're so passionate about.
Well, I really appreciate you guys having me on, and I enjoyed the conversation.
So that was Gary Myers. Dan, I know you've been wanting to have him on the podcast for a long time. What'd you think?
He was fantastic, obviously. I mean, I've had, my passion for the New York Giants and a love of all things 1980s Giants football, I think kind of shines through on this podcast. And he's one of the few writers who covered the Bill Parcells era, or at least the tail end. And he's been involved in so many fascinating stories around the NFL, not just covering the Giants during that era, but covering the Cowboys, his work, chronicling the Peyton Manning, Tom Brady rivalry, his podcast. He has really been one of the most instrumental journalists covering the National Football League, I guess, during my adult life. And it's always a pleasure to talk to somebody, like Gary, who's, really, really been fun to follow all these years. I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as we did. I mean, not every week needs to be, dissecting a judicial case. I think talking to some fascinating, newsmakers and those who chronicle the industry that we follow also makes for a very compelling episode. And Gary is just, one of the most insightful people and writers who's ever covered the National Football League. So we were very fortunate to have him on.
Just quick, I wanted to add something new this week and give a shout out to all of our listeners. Our listenership has been steadily climbing since Dan and I united a couple episodes, maybe a couple months ago at this point. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to the people that are leaving us some reviews. As always, we don't just say rate, review the podcast, but we do the ratings, and the reviews truly do help. I want to give a quick shout out to Skylar Corbin. He's a law student over at Tulane. He gave us this great review. Conduct Detrimental adds an engaging, insightful, and in-depth look at some of the most pressing issues in sports, business, and law. Dan and Dan have a great dynamic and are always discussing the latest topics with great precision and insight. Great for law students interested in pursuing a career in sports law, as well as current lawyers interested in pivoting. And Dan, I'm going to give you one more. This one's shorter. This is from a user. I don't know who it is, but shout out to Mass12Y. Dan and Dan are the best. Highly recommend to stay up to date on industry news with expert analysis. Dan, there's no qualifier there. We're just the best in general. We're the best human beings. We're not even the best podcasters. Just the best people.
Yeah, amazing that you found non-family members who've written positive reviews. I'm pretty impressed by that. And all joking aside, we're really grateful for the feedback that you provide us over the past couple of months, and our listeners mean everything to us. I mean, we wouldn't be doing this podcast without your interest and participation. If you could give us any kind of feedback, reviews,
only positive. Help us. You're not listening to them.
Yeah,
we have nothing to improve.
Help us grow our ranking on Apple, and we really enjoy doing this podcast. We don't do it for compensation. We're passionate about sports law, and Dan and I have really, I think, found something really fun to do together like this. And I think we have great chemistry, and I think we fill an important niche in the world of sports and law. And we're going to keep doing this. So thanks for your support, all of the listeners out there. And really just, we'll keep bringing this to you. And we look forward to engaging with you if you have any topic ideas or you ever want to just reach out to us. So, thank you for your continued support.
We don't do this for compensation, but Dan, if Coca-Cola brand manager is listening, we'll sponsor Coca-Cola. I won't drink Pepsi anymore. I won't do it. It's fine. So Dan, let's put this in the books. As always, Dan Wallach is on social media at Wallach Legal. Myself, Dan Lust at Sports Law Lust. The show, Conduct Detrimental at Con Detrimental. So for Dan and myself, we will put this episode in the books, and we will see you next week on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.